It was a quiet afternoon in the heart of a suburban neighborhood where life often moved at a predictable pace. The kind of place where people waved at each other from their porches and children played on freshly mowed lawns. But that day, something would shatter the calm, leaving everyone questioning what they thought they knew about justice, kindness, and the truth. The scene unfolded at a local park, a gathering spot for teens after school. A small group of high school kids had gathered near the basketball court, their laughter and whispers growing louder as they huddled together. In the center of their circle was a little girl, no older than 7, sitting quietly in her wheelchair. Her face was a mixture of confusion and fear as the teens jeered and pointed at her. They laughed at her clothes, mocked her hair, and made cruel jokes, their voices echoing off the park's trees. The little girl, whose name was Ava, had come to the park with her older sister, Maya. Maya had stepped away for just a moment to grab Ava's favorite snack from a nearby stand. Thinking her sister would be safe in the open, sunny park, she couldn't have imagined that the short time she was gone would turn into a nightmare. As Ava tried to shrink away from the taunts, her eyes welled up with tears, but she didn't cry out. Instead, she sat frozen, gripping the armrests of her wheelchair, her small frame trembling under the weight of the attention she hadn't asked for. The group of teens, emboldened by each other's laughter, didn't seem to notice or care that they were picking on someone who couldn't even defend herself. Just then, a police officer walked into the scene. Officer Bradley, a middle-aged man with a clean-shaven face and a badge that gleamed in the sunlight, had been patrolling the area. Known in the neighborhood for his strict demeanor, he was the kind of officer people trusted to keep the peace. His presence immediately caught everyone's attention, including the teens. They hushed for a moment, their eyes darting between each other, unsure of what would happen next. Ava looked up at him, her eyes pleading silently for help. For a moment, it seemed like Officer Bradley might step in and put an end to the bullying. He approached the group with a stern expression, his boots crunching against the gravel path as he moved closer. Everyone in the park seemed to hold their breath. But what happened next stunned everyone. Instead of addressing the teens' behavior, Officer Bradley let out a chuckle, one that seemed to align him with the group rather than the little girl. "What's going on here?" he asked casually, his tone lacking any hint of seriousness. One of the teens, emboldened by the officer's relaxed attitude, pointed at Ava and said, "She's just sitting here, being weird." The officer smirked, shaking his head lightly. "Kids these days," he muttered under his breath. But rather than telling the teens to stop, he folded his arms and stood there, as if silently approving of their actions. Ava's eyes widened in disbelief. Wasn't he supposed to protect her? Wasn't he supposed to stand up against injustice? At that moment, Maya returned, holding a bag of snacks in her hands. She froze when she saw the scene in front of her, her little sister surrounded by bullies, tears in her eyes, and a police officer doing nothing to help. Her heart pounded in her chest as she dropped the bag and rushed toward Ava, her voice cutting through the tension. "What's going on here?" The teens quickly dispersed, their laughter fading as they scattered like leaves in the wind. But the officer didn't move. He stood there, his arms still crossed, as Maya crouched down to check on Ava. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling with worry. Ava nodded, but the fear in her eyes told a different story. Maya stood up, her gaze locking onto Officer Bradley. "Why didn't you do anything?" "They were bullying her," she demanded, her voice firm despite the tears threatening to spill from her eyes. The officer shrugged, his indifferent demeanor striking a nerve. "Kids will be kids," he said simply, as if that was enough of an explanation. Maya couldn't believe what she was hearing. She felt anger bubbling up inside her, but before she could respond, something unexpected happened. An older man who had been sitting on a bench nearby walked over, his face a mixture of concern and determination. He placed a hand on Maya's shoulder and turned to Officer Bradley. "Is this how you uphold the law?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. The officer seemed taken aback by the man's question. For the first time, there was a flicker of uncertainty in his expression. The older man introduced himself as Mr. Carter, a retired teacher who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. He had seen it all, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and he wasn't about to let this slide. "I think you've forgotten what your badge stands for," Mr. Carter continued, his voice carrying a quiet strength. "It's not just a piece of metal. It's a promise to protect everyone, especially those who can't protect themselves." The officer's jaw tightened, but he didn't say anything. The small crowd that had gathered began to murmur, their voices growing louder as they questioned the officer's actions, or lack thereof. The tension in the air was palpable, and it was clear that this wasn't just about Ava anymore. It was about something bigger. It was about accountability, justice, and the kind of world they wanted to live in. And then, as if fate itself had decided to intervene, a voice called out from behind the crowd. "Wait." Everyone turned to see a teenage boy running toward them, his face flushed as if he had been debating whether or not to step forward. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice shaky but determined. What the boy revealed next would change everything. It would expose truths that had been hidden, challenge assumptions, and force everyone, Officer Bradley included, to confront their own actions and beliefs. But for now, the crowd stood in stunned silence, waiting for him to speak, as the story took an unexpected turn no one could have predicted. The teenage boy stood in the middle of the gathering, his chest rising and falling as he tried to catch his breath. All eyes were on him now, but his attention was locked on Officer Bradley. There was something about the way the boy looked at the officer, like he knew something no one else did. For a moment, the world around them seemed to pause, the sound of birds chirping and leaves rustling in the breeze fading into the background. "I was part of it," the boy finally said, his voice trembling. He pointed at the group of teens who had been mocking Ava earlier, some of whom were still lingering in the distance, watching nervously. "I was there, but what happened wasn't how it looked." Maya narrowed her eyes, folding her arms across her chest. "What are you trying to say?" she asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. She had no patience for excuses, not after what Ava had just endured. But the boy seemed genuinely shaken, his gaze shifting between Maya, Mr. Carter, and Officer Bradley. "It wasn't supposed to go that far," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We were just messing around, you know. At first it was just a joke. But then—" He hesitated, his words catching in his throat. It got out of hand, and the officer, The boy stopped mid-sentence, his face twisting with guilt. "You didn't stop us because you told us not to." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Maya's heart pounded in her chest as she processed what she had just heard. "What do you mean he told you not to?" she demanded, stepping closer to the boy. Her voice was filled with both disbelief and fury. Ava clung to Maya's leg, her small fingers gripping tightly as if seeking protection. The boy hesitated, glancing nervously at Officer Bradley. The officer's expression hardened, his posture growing defensive. "Watch what you're saying, kid," Bradley warned, his voice low and threatening. But the boy didn't back down. If anything, the fear in his eyes was replaced by a flicker of determination. "You told us to leave her alone at first," the boy continued, his words spilling out in a rush. "But when we didn't listen, you said something like, let her toughen up. She needs to learn how the world works." His voice broke on the last few words, and he looked away, ashamed. "I thought it was okay because you were there. I thought." He stopped, shaking his head as if trying to shake off his own naivety. "I thought it wasn't a big deal." Maya felt a surge of anger rise within her. She turned to Officer Bradley, her eyes blazing. "Is that true?" she asked, her voice shaking with emotion. "Did you really say that?" The crowd around them murmured in disbelief, their attention fixed on the officer. Bradley straightened his posture, his expression unreadable. "That's not what happened," he said firmly, his voice carrying an air of authority. "The kid's twisting my words. I told them to stop. They just didn't listen. Teenagers don't always do what they're told, you know." The boy shook his head vehemently. "That's not true. You didn't stop us. You just stood there and let it happen." His voice cracked, and he looked down at the ground, his hands trembling. "I don't know why I listened to you. I don't know why I thought it was okay." Maya's mind raced as she tried to make sense of the conflicting accounts. On one hand, the boy seemed genuinely remorseful, and his words rang with a painful truth. On the other hand, Officer Bradley was an authority figure, a man whose job was to protect and serve. It was hard to believe he would so blatantly fail in his duty. But then again, wasn't that exactly what she had seen with her own eyes? Mr. Carter stepped forward, his calm presence grounding the chaotic energy of the moment. He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, his voice gentle but firm. "Son, I want you to think carefully before you say anything else. This is serious. Are you absolutely sure about what you're telling us?" The boy nodded, tears brimming in his eyes. "I know what I saw, I know what he said, and I know it was wrong." He glanced at Ava, who was still clutching Maya's leg. "I didn't mean to hurt her. I didn't think it would hurt this much." Maya knelt down beside Ava, brushing a tear from her sister's cheek. "It's okay, sweetheart," she whispered, though her voice was thick with emotion. She wanted to comfort Ava, but she also knew that her sister deserved the truth, and right now, the truth was as murky as the tension hanging in the air. Meanwhile, the crowd had grown larger, with more people from the neighborhood gathering to see what was happening. Some whispered among themselves, others stood silently, their expressions ranging from shock to anger. A few even pulled out their phones, recording the unfolding scene. It was clear that this moment was bigger than just one officer, one boy, or even one little girl in a wheelchair. It was about something deeper, something that had been simmering beneath the surface for a long time. Officer Bradley seemed to sense the shift in the crowd's mood. He raised his hands defensively, his voice growing louder as he addressed them. "Listen, I'm here to keep the peace. That's what I've always done, and that's what I was trying to do today. If this kid misunderstood me, that's on him. But don't stand here and accuse me of something I didn't do." Maya stood up, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "You had a chance to stop them," she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "But you didn't. You stood there and let them humiliate my sister, and now you're trying to act like it's no big deal." Mr. Carter placed a hand on Maya's arm, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the fiery emotions swirling around them. "Let's not jump to conclusions," he said softly, though his eyes were fixed on Bradley. "But we do need answers." At that moment, another voice broke through the tension. I recorded it. A young girl stepped forward from the crowd, holding up her phone. She couldn't have been more than 15, her face a mixture of nervousness and resolve. "I was sitting on the bench over there, and I saw everything. I didn't think anyone would believe me, so I recorded it." The crowd fell silent, all eyes now on the girl. She hesitated, looking down at her phone as if unsure whether to proceed. But then she took a deep breath and held it out to Maya. "You should see this." Maya's hands shook as she took the phone, her heart pounding in her chest. She glanced at Mr. Carter, who nodded encouragingly, before pressing play. The video was shaky but clear enough to capture what had happened. The mocking voices of the teens rang out, their taunts directed at Ava. And then came Officer Bradley's voice, unmistakable and chilling. "Let her toughen up. She needs to learn how the world works." The crowd erupted into a mixture of gasps and murmurs, the weight of the evidence sinking in. Maya's breath caught in her throat as she looked up at Bradley, who had gone pale. "Care to explain that?" she asked, her voice trembling with both anger and disbelief. Bradley opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time, the confident officer looked uncertain, his gaze darting around the crowd as if searching for a way out. The tension in the air was suffocating, and everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The silence that followed the video was deafening. It was the kind of quiet that only comes when a room, or, in this case, a park, is on the brink of exploding. Maya's hands clenched the phone tightly, her knuckles white as she stared at Officer Bradley. She didn't need to say anything. The video had said it all. The crowd, once hesitant and unsure, was now buzzing with indignation. "How could you say that to kids?" Someone from the back of the crowd yelled, their voice sharp and accusing. Another person added, "You're supposed to protect us, not encourage this kind of behavior." The murmurs grew louder, frustration and disbelief spreading like wildfire. Bradley shifted uncomfortably, his usually composed demeanor cracking under the weight of the crowd's judgment. The young girl who had recorded the video stepped closer to Maya, her hands trembling as she looked up at her. "I didn't know if I should show it," she admitted quietly. "But I couldn't just sit there and do nothing. What they did to your sister wasn't right." Maya knelt down and placed a hand on the girl's shoulder, her voice soft but filled with gratitude. "You did the right thing," she said. "Thank you." Eva, still clinging to Maya's side, looked up at the girl with wide eyes, as if she had found a new hero in the midst of the chaos. Meanwhile, Officer Bradley raised his hands, trying to regain control of the situation. "Listen," he began, his voice louder but strained, "you're all taking this out of context. I've been a police officer in this community for years. I've always done my best to serve and protect, but sometimes situations aren't as simple as they look. You don't understand the pressures of this job." "Pressures." Mr. Carter's voice cut through the noise like a blade. He stepped forward, his calm but commanding presence quieting the crowd momentarily. "You think this is about pressure. This is about accountability. This is about a little girl who trusted you to stand up for her, and you let her down. You didn't just fail her, you failed all of us." Bradley opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, another voice spoke up. It was one of the teens from the group that had been bullying Ava. The boy looked nervous, his eyes darting between Bradley and the crowd. He didn't just ignore it," the boy stammered. "He told us we could keep going as long as we didn't take it too far." His voice was shaky, but the words hit like a hammer. The crowd gasped again, their anger mounting. Maya's heart sank further as she looked at the officer. She had held out a small shred of hope that maybe, just maybe, there had been some kind of misunderstanding. But with every passing moment, that hope dwindled. Bradley's face reddened, his frustration boiling over. "I didn't mean it like that," he snapped, his voice defensive. "I was trying to de-escalate the situation without making it worse. Sometimes you have to use a different approach with teenagers. They don't respond to authority the way adults do." "Different approach." Maya's voice was sharp, her anger breaking through the surface. "You call standing there and letting them bully my sister a different approach. You had the power to stop it, and you chose not to. That's not de-escalation, that's negligence." The crowd murmured in agreement, their voices rising in a wave of disapproval. Bradley's eyes darted around, his confidence crumbling. He seemed to realize that his usual excuses wouldn't work here, not with so many people watching and not with the video evidence now out in the open. Maya's anger burned hot, but underneath it was a deep sadness for Ava, who had already faced more challenges in her young life than most people could imagine. Ava, who had been born with a condition that left her in a wheelchair, but never once let it dim her spirit. Ava, who loved going to the park because it made her feel free. And now that sense of freedom had been stolen from her in a single afternoon. Mr. Carter, ever the steady voice of reason, turned to the crowd. "Let's not lose sight of what's important here," he said. "This isn't just about one incident. It's about how we, as a community, respond to it. Are we going to let this slide, or are we going to demand better for Ava, for Maya, and for all of us?" The crowd murmured in agreement, their anger shifting into resolve. People began talking among themselves, discussing what could be done to hold Officer Bradley accountable. Some suggested filing a formal complaint with the police department, while others talked about organizing a community meeting to address the broader issues of bullying and accountability. As the conversation swirled around her, Maya knelt down beside Ava again. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" she asked softly, brushing a strand of hair from her sister's face. Ava nodded, but her eyes were still wide with fear. "Can we go home now?" she asked in a small voice. Maya's heart broke at the question. She wanted nothing more than to scoop Ava up and take her far away from this chaos, to protect her from the harsh realities of the world. But she also knew that leaving now would feel like letting Bradley and the bullies off the hook. And she couldn't do that, not for Ava, not for herself, and not for the other kids who might face similar situations in the future. As Maya stood, her resolve hardened. She turned to Mr. Carter. "What do we do next?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside her. "How do we make sure this doesn't happen again?" Mr. Carter looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. "We start by holding people accountable," he said. "But more importantly, we start by teaching our kids, and ourselves, what it means to truly stand up for what's right." In the distance, Bradley was on the phone, his expression tense as he spoke to someone, perhaps a superior or a colleague. The crowd watched him warily, their trust in him completely shattered. The once proud officer now seemed small and uncertain, a stark contrast to the authority he had wielded earlier. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, the crowd slowly began to disperse. But the sense of resolve lingered, like a spark ready to ignite into something bigger. People exchanged phone numbers, promising to stay in touch and follow through on their plans to seek justice and change. Maya held Ava close as they walked home, her mind racing with thoughts of what had happened and what still needed to be done. She knew this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be long and difficult, filled with obstacles and resistance. But she also knew that she wasn't alone. The community had rallied around her and Ava, and together, they would fight for a better, fairer future. The days that followed felt like a blur to Maya. The video of Officer Bradley's words spread quickly through the neighborhood, then beyond. Someone had uploaded it to social media, and within hours, it had gone viral. The reactions were swift and overwhelming. Comments flooded in from people around the country, expressing outrage, disbelief, and support for Ava. But with the wave of support also came voices of doubt and dismissal. Some questioned the authenticity of the video, while others defended Bradley, claiming his words were being taken out of context. Maya stayed up late every night, reading through the comments and news articles, her emotions swinging between hope and frustration. It was surreal to see her little sister's face on so many screens, her vulnerability laid bare for the world to see. Ava, for her part, didn't fully understand the magnitude of what was happening. She just wanted things to go back to normal, to go to the park without fear, to feel like a kid again. The community had rallied together in the wake of the incident, determined to hold Officer Bradley accountable. A town hall meeting was scheduled for the following week, and the buzz around it was palpable. People whispered about what might happen, whether Bradley would show up, and what would be done to address the deeper issues the incident had brought to light. Maya wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew she had to be there. For Ava, for herself, for the countless others who had experienced something similar, but never had their voices heard. Mr. Carter became an anchor for Maya during this time, helping her navigate the complexities of speaking out against someone in a position of power. He encouraged her to channel her emotions into action, and together they prepared to share their story at the town hall. "You don't have to do this alone," he reminded her one evening as they sat at the kitchen table, going over their notes. "The truth is on your side, and so are we." The night of the town hall arrived, and the community center was packed to capacity. The air was thick with tension as people filled the room, their voices hushed but charged with energy. Maya sat near the front with Ava, her hands trembling as she clutched the folder containing her notes. She glanced at Ava, who was drawing quietly in her coloring book, seemingly unaware of the gravity of the moment. When the meeting began, the mayor stood at the podium, her expression solemn as she addressed the crowd. She acknowledged the video, the outrage it had sparked, and the need for accountability. Then she invited members of the community to speak. One by one, people came forward, sharing their thoughts and experiences. Some spoke about their own encounters with Officer Bradley, painting a picture of a man who often let his biases cloud his judgment. Others spoke more broadly about the need for systemic change, urging the town to take a hard look at how authority was exercised in their community. When it was Maya's turn to speak, her heart pounded in her chest. She stood slowly, feeling the weight of the room's eyes on her as she walked to the podium. Eva watched her intently, her small hands resting on the wheels of her chair. Taking a deep breath, Maya began to speak. She talked about what had happened that day in the park, about the pain of watching her sister be humiliated, and the anger she felt when the person who should have stopped it chose not to. Her voice shook at first, but as she continued, it grew stronger, fueled by the support of those around her. "This isn't just about Ava," Maya said, her voice steady now. "This is about all of us. It's about what we teach our children, what we tolerate in our community, and what we're willing to stand up for. My sister deserves better. We all deserve better." The room erupted into applause as Maya stepped down, her cheeks flushed with emotion. She returned to her seat, where Ava reached up to grab her hand, offering her a small, reassuring smile. Maya squeezed her sister's hand, feeling a swell of pride and determination. But the tension in the room escalated when Officer Bradley himself walked in. The crowd quieted instantly, all eyes turning toward him as he made his way to the front of the room. His face was unreadable, his usual air of authority replaced by something more subdued. He stood at the podium, the weight of the moment visibly pressing down on him. "I'm here tonight because of Iva's community and explanation," Bradley began, his voice calm but firm. "I've seen the video. I've heard the accusations, and I know how it looks." He paused, glancing around the room. "I won't lie. I could have handled that situation better. I should have handled it better. But I never intended to harm anyone. What I said that day, it was a mistake. A lapse in judgment." The crowd murmured, some nodding in approval, while others remained skeptical. Maya's jaw tightened as she listened, her earlier anger bubbling to the surface. It wasn't enough. An apology, if that's what this even was, wouldn't undo the harm that had been done. It wouldn't erase the pain in Ava's eyes or the fear that still lingered in her heart. Bradley continued, his voice growing more defensive. "I've dedicated my life to this community," he said, "and I've made mistakes, like anyone else. But I'm not a bad person. I'm not the monster some of you are making me out to be." The crowd's murmurs grew louder, the tension reaching a boiling point. Someone shouted, "What about the kids you let bully that little girl?" Another voice added, "What are you going to do to make this right?" The room buzzed with frustration and anger, the once civil discussion threatening to unravel into chaos. Maya stood, her voice cutting through the noise. "This isn't about whether you're a good person," she said, her words sharp and deliberate. "This is about accountability. It's about the choices you made and the impact they had. My sister deserved your protection, and you failed her. So don't stand there and try to make this about you." The room fell silent, her words hanging in the air like a challenge. Bradley stared at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, it felt like the entire room was holding its breath, waiting to see what he would say next. But before he could respond, a voice from the back of the room broke the silence. "I think we need to hear from the kids," the voice said. It was the teenage boy who had first spoken out about Bradley's actions. He stepped forward hesitantly, his hands stuffed into his pockets. "We were the ones who bullied Alva. We listened to him because we thought it was okay. But it wasn't, and we know that now." His words sent a ripple through the room, the tension deepening as everyone turned their attention to him. The boy glanced at Bradley, then at Maya and Eva. "We're sorry," he said, his voice cracking. "I'm sorry. I don't know if it means anything, but I want to do better. I want to make things right." Maya's heart softened slightly at the boy's sincerity, but the larger issues still loomed. The apology was a step, but it wasn't enough. The air in the room was thick with anticipation, the story teetering on the edge of resolution, but not quite there yet. The crowd waited, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone as the conflict reached its peak. The boy's apology hung in the air, raw and unfiltered, causing the crowd to fall silent. Maya looked at him, searching for any trace of insincerity, but all she saw was regret. She wanted to believe him, wanted to think that maybe this incident had been a wake-up call for someone, even if it didn't erase the pain Ava felt. But before she could respond, a voice from the back of the room disrupted the fragile quiet. "I don't think we're getting the whole story here," a woman said, her tone sharp and accusatory. She stepped forward, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Maya didn't recognize her, but there was a chill in her words that immediately put her on edge. Why isn't anyone asking why these kids thought it was okay to act the way they did, or why Officer Bradley reacted the way he did? There's more to this, and I think we all deserve to know. Maya's stomach tightened. The crowd murmured in agreement, some nodding while others exchanged skeptical glances. The woman's statement felt like a challenge, one that threatened to shift the focus away from the core issue. For a brief moment, Maya feared that the crowd's attention would waver, that the momentum they had built would dissolve into doubt and confusion. But then something unexpected happened. Another voice, this time softer, hesitant, spoke up. "Actually, she's right," the boy who had apologized said, his face pale as he glanced around nervously. "There is more. We weren't just messing around that day. Someone told us what to do." The room froze, the tension palpable as his words sank in. Maya felt her heart pound in her chest, her mind racing to process what she had just heard. Who could have been behind this? Why would anyone want to orchestrate something so cruel? She glanced at Ava, who was fidgeting with the edge of her sweater, her expression unreadable. The realization that there was more to the story felt like a weight pressing down on her, but she also felt a renewed sense of determination. Whatever the truth was, they needed to uncover it. The boy hesitated before continuing, his voice barely above a whisper. It was a dare, he admitted, his eyes fixed on the ground. But it wasn't just us. Someone older put us up to it. They said it'd be funny, and we didn't think it through. The crowd erupted into murmurs again, their reactions ranging from disbelief to outrage. Maya's mind raced, trying to piece together what this new revelation could mean. The idea that someone older, someone who should have known better, had instigated the bullying made the entire situation even more horrifying. And it raised even more questions. Who was this person? What was their motive? And most importantly, why had Officer Bradley allowed it to escalate instead of stepping in? The mayor, clearly struggling to maintain order, called for quiet. "If what this young man is saying is true," she said, her voice firm, "then we need to investigate this further. But right now, let's stay focused on the immediate issue at hand." But the damage was already done. The boy's admission had shifted the energy in the room, and Maya could feel the collective doubt creeping back in. She clenched her fists, her anger simmering just beneath the surface. She wasn't going to let this new twist derail their fight for justice. Not for Ava, not for anyone. Then, as if on cue, another unexpected voice cut through the noise. "I know who it was," a girl said, stepping forward from the group of teenagers. Her hands trembled as she clutched the edge of her jacket, but her eyes were steady as she looked directly at Maya. It was one of the parents. The room fell silent again, the weight of her words landing like a thunderclap. Maya felt her breath catch in her throat. A parent? The revelation was almost too much to process. Why would an adult encourage kids to bully a little girl in a wheelchair? What kind of person would stoop so low? The girl's gaze flickered to Officer Bradley, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat, and he knew, she added, her voice breaking. He knew it was happening. He just didn't stop it. The crowd erupted into chaos. Shouts of anger and disbelief filled the room, people demanding answers and hurling accusations. Bradley's face hardened, his earlier humility replaced by a defensive glare. "That's not true," he said, his voice rising above the commotion. "I didn't know anything about this. You can't just throw out baseless accusations." But the girl didn't back down. "You knew," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. You were standing right there when they dared us. You laughed. You said it wasn't a big deal. Maya felt like the ground had shifted beneath her. The revelation painted an even darker picture of what had happened that day, and it left no doubt in her mind that Bradley's actions, or lack thereof, were deliberate. This wasn't just about a moment of poor judgment. It was about a pattern of behavior, a toxic culture that had been allowed to fester under the surface for far too long. The mayor banged her gavel, calling for order, but the crowd was too riled up to calm down. People shouted over each other, their anger and frustration boiling over. Maya sat frozen, her mind racing as she tried to process everything. The fight for justice had just gotten a lot more complicated, and the stakes had never been higher. The room's chaos was deafening, voices overlapping in anger and confusion. The mayor's gavel finally brought the crowd to a reluctant silence. All eyes turned to Officer Bradley, whose face had shifted from defensiveness to something else, something closer to unease. Maya watched him closely, her instincts telling her that there was more to his involvement than he was letting on. The weight of the accusations, the damning details, seemed to hang heavily in the air, pressing down on everyone. "I didn't laugh," Bradley said, his voice firmer now, but tinged with desperation. "I didn't encourage this. I didn't tell those kids to do anything." He glanced at the girl who had spoken, his eyes narrowing. "You're lying." "I'm not lying," the girl shot back, her voice rising with emotion. "You laughed when they dared us. You said it was kids being kids. You didn't think it mattered, but it mattered to her." She pointed at Alva, who sat quietly in her chair, her wide eyes taking in the tension around her. The accusation seemed to shake Bradley, but he quickly masked it with indignation. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Maya could see his composure beginning to crack, the carefully constructed facade slipping with every word. And then, from the back of the room, another voice spoke, this one low and steady. "He's not telling the whole truth." Everyone turned to see Mr. Carter standing, his expression grim. He stepped forward, the crowd parting to let him through. Maya's heart raced as he approached the podium, his presence commanding attention. "Officer Bradley," Mr. Carter said, his voice calm but piercing, "why didn't you tell the community about the conversation you had with one of the parents at the park that day? The one where you agreed to let the kids have their fun, because, as you put it, they'll grow out of it." The room erupted again, gasps and murmurs filling the air. Bradley's face went pale, his hands gripping the edge of the podium. "That's not," he started, but Mr. Carter cut him off. "I was there," he said, his voice rising slightly. "I saw you. I heard you. You weren't just a bystander, you were complicit. You stood there and allowed those kids to humiliate Ava because you didn't think it was worth stepping in. You thought it was harmless, but it wasn't harmless to her." Maya felt a surge of gratitude toward Mr. Carter, but it was quickly overshadowed by the rage bubbling inside her. She stood, her voice steady and clear as she addressed Bradley directly. "You had a choice," she said. "You could have stopped it. You could have protected her. But you didn't, and now you're trying to lie your way out of it." Bradley's composure shattered. "I didn't think it would go that far," he shouted, his voice breaking. "I thought it was just teasing. I didn't know they'd—" He stopped abruptly, as if realizing he'd said too much. The room went silent again, the weight of his words sinking in. Bradley's confession, though incomplete, was enough to confirm what everyone had suspected. He had known, and he had chosen not to act. The betrayal was staggering, and the crowd's anger quickly reignited. People began shouting again, their demands for accountability growing louder and more urgent. But before the mayor could regain control of the room, another unexpected twist emerged. From the middle of the crowd, a man stood up, one of the parents Maya recognized from the park. His face was pale, his expression riddled with guilt. "It was me," he said, his voice shaking. "I was the one who dared the kids. I didn't mean for it to go that far, either. I thought it was just a joke." The room erupted into chaos once more, but this time the focus shifted to the man, who looked utterly defeated. He explained, haltingly, how he had encouraged the kids to tease Ava, thinking it would be harmless fun. He hadn't anticipated the emotional damage it would cause or the ripple effect it would have on the community. Maya felt a mix of emotions: anger, disbelief, and a deep sadness for Ava, who had been caught in the middle of this web of poor choices and misplaced intentions. But there was also a sense of relief that the truth was finally coming to light. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and with them came the opportunity for real accountability and change. The mayor, visibly shaken by the revelations, took the microphone. "What we've heard tonight is deeply troubling," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "This is not just about one incident. It's about a culture that allows prejudice, bullying, and neglect to go unchecked. We need to do better for Ava, for our children, and for our community." The meeting ended with promises of an independent investigation into Officer Bradley's actions, as well as plans to implement anti-bullying initiatives and sensitivity training for both law enforcement and the community. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a step in the right direction. As the crowd began to disperse, Maya knelt beside Ava's wheelchair, holding her sister's hand tightly. "You're so brave," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so proud of you." Ava looked at her, her eyes bright with hope. "Does this mean it's over?" she asked softly. Maya shook her head, smiling gently. "Not yet," she said, "but it's a start." As they left the community center, Maya felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight wasn't over, but they weren't alone anymore. The truth had been revealed, and with it came the chance to create a better future, not just for Ava, but for everyone. As the crowd trickled out of the community center, there was a lingering sense of unease mixed with hope. Maya pushed Ava's wheelchair toward the exit, her mind replaying the night's events like a movie stuck on a loop. The revelations had been heavy, almost overwhelming, but they had brought to light truths that could no longer be ignored. People who had remained silent for too long were finally speaking up, and Maya hoped that momentum would lead to meaningful change. Outside, the air was cool and quiet, a sharp contrast to the heated emotions inside. Ava sat silently, her small hands resting on her lap as she stared up at the stars. Maya knelt down beside her, searching her sister's face for any sign of how she was feeling. "You okay?" Maya asked gently, her voice breaking the stillness. Ava turned to her, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think they'll really change?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. "The kids, the officer, everyone." Maya sighed, unsure how to answer. She didn't want to make promises she couldn't keep, but she also didn't want Ava to lose hope. "I think it's going to take time," she said honestly. "But tonight was a step. People saw what happened to you, Ava. They can't ignore it anymore. And even if it's hard, even if it's slow, I believe things can get better." Ava nodded, her gaze returning to the sky. She seemed older in that moment, as if the events of the past few days had forced her to grow up too quickly. Maya's heart ached for her, but she also felt a deep sense of pride. Ava's courage had sparked something powerful, something that could ripple far beyond their small community. As they walked home, their mom met them at the door, her face lined with worry. She wrapped both of them in a tight hug, holding on as if she never wanted to let go. "You did good tonight," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Both of you." In the days that followed, the community's focus shifted toward action. The mayor announced a series of changes, including a formal investigation into Officer Bradley's conduct and mandatory training programs for local law enforcement. The school also stepped up, implementing stricter anti-bullying policies and organizing workshops to teach empathy and inclusion. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. Maya and Ava watched these changes unfold with a mixture of hope and skepticism. There were moments of progress, like when one of the teens involved in the bullying wrote Ava a heartfelt letter of apology. But there were also setbacks. Some people resisted the changes, dismissing them as unnecessary or overly dramatic. Others tried to downplay what had happened, insisting it was just a misunderstanding. Through it all, Maya remained steadfast. She attended every meeting, spoke at every rally, and made sure Ava's story stayed at the forefront of the conversation. She knew the fight for justice wasn't just about one incident, it was about challenging a culture that allowed prejudice and cruelty to thrive. And while it was exhausting, she also felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced before. One afternoon, a few weeks after the town hall meeting, Maya and Ava were sitting on the porch, enjoying the warm sunlight. Ava was drawing in her sketchbook, her brow furrowed in concentration as she added the finishing touches to a picture of a butterfly. Maya watched her, marveling at how resilient her sister was. Despite everything she had been through, Ava's spirit remained unbroken. "Hey, Maya," Ava said suddenly, looking up from her drawing. "Do you think I'll ever forget what happened?" Maya considered the question carefully. "I don't think you'll ever forget," she said, "but I think it'll get easier. And I think one day, when you look back, you'll see how strong it made you. You'll see how you stood up for yourself and how you helped other people stand up too." Ava smiled, her eyes shining with quiet determination. "Maybe," she said, her voice filled with a sense of hope that made Maya's chest tighten. "I just want people to be kinder. I don't want anyone else to feel the way I did." Maya reached over and squeezed her hand. "That's why we keep going," she said. "For you, and for everyone else." As the weeks turned into months, the community began to heal. The investigation into Officer Bradley concluded with his resignation, and the parent who had instigated the bullying publicly apologized, pledging to volunteer with anti-bullying programs to make amends. It didn't erase what had happened, but it was a step toward accountability. Ava became somewhat of a local hero, her story inspiring others to speak out against injustice. She even started an art project at school, encouraging her classmates to create drawings and paintings that celebrated kindness and diversity. The project gained so much attention that it was eventually displayed at the local library, drawing visitors from all over town. Maya couldn't have been prouder. Watching Ava blossom in the aftermath of such a painful experience was nothing short of incredible. It reminded her that even in the darkest moments, there was always a chance for growth, for light to break through. One evening, as they were sitting down for dinner, Ava looked up at Maya with a mischievous grin. "Do you think they'll make a movie about us one day?" she asked, her eyes twinkling. Maya laughed, shaking her head. "Maybe," she said, "but if they do, you better believe you're the star." Ava giggled, her laughter filling the room and warming Maya's heart. For the first time in a long while, things felt normal again. Not perfect, but better, and that was enough. As the family finished their meal and settled in for the night, Maya couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. The journey they had been on was far from easy, but it had brought them closer together and taught them the power of resilience, compassion, and standing up for what's right. The story might have started with pain, but it ended with hope, a reminder that even in the face of adversity, change is possible. And for Maya and Ava, that was just the beginning.